Okay. All right. I think it's good now.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, Dad.
Good afternoon.
Today is Wednesday, July 23rd, or it's good morning for me. You are in Moscow, Russia right now. I haven't
Right.
talked to you actually since you landed. So, how is everything going over there?
Yeah. Well, the weather's very pleasant. Yeah, the flight was uneventful. We were actually worried about drone attacks that have shut down the Moscow airports several times in the last couple of weeks, but no drones. Yeah, we landed, without incident, and everything went fine.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I want to talk to you a bit more about Ukraine and Russia today. But first, maybe just touch on Gaza. Mainly because it's just been that's where my heart and mind has been at recently. It's hard to tear myself away. It just feels like things are getting worse and worse every day. I'm seeing just more and more horrific footage and photos and videos of dead and dying children. It's really hard to just kind of tear yourself away from that.
Yeah.
So is the situation getting worse in Gaza right now? I mean, is there any sign of hope? There's one
Well,
thing
yeah.
there's
In a
one
sense,
thing I
it's always
saw.
getting worse, but go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, there's just one thing that I saw that I wanted to bring up is that I don't know if it's true, but I've been seeing on X that China is threatening to intervene, saying that the world can't stand by and just watch this genocide. But I don't know if that's true. I think it's just something tweeted, and then I think maybe George
Yeah.
Galloway retweeted it, and I thought maybe it's true. But is there any sign
Right.
that some power, somebody
Yeah.
can come in and stop this madness?
Unfortunately, yeah. Unfortunately, not. I don't think that's true. I would be very, very happy to find out that I was wrong about, but I don't think it's true. Uh, China continues to trade with Israel. China, denounces Israel along with, Russia and other powers, the vast majority of the world and votes in the UN and that kind of thing, and does make other statements, condemning the Israeli actions. But they haven't taken, they have not gone beyond that. That's just a fact. And yeah, again, it's the powers that really, first of all, I think it's like the neighboring powers and the other Muslim powers really have the obligation. They're talking about their brothers in the faith. They're talking about their geographic neighbors. It's countries like Turkey and Egypt and certainly Saudi Arabia that really should be doing something and are not. And that's
Why is that?
yeah, it's well, that's a difficult question. It's something that I wonder about. Look, the countries that have taken real action are not even, they're Muslim, but they're not Sunni. We're talking about Hezbollah, which is Shia, or the Houthis. So they're also some sort of offshoot of the Shias. And the Sunnis, there are clearly many, many Sunnis that are very upset in these countries, but none of these governments are taking action. Some of them are, most of them are just um, their opposition is limited to words. It's purely rhetorical. And the worst case, the most obvious case, of course, is Erdogan in Turkey, who every other day or, maybe once a week gives some sort of fiery speech denouncing the Israelis. Sometimes uses even very extreme language, but nothing changes. The oil continues to flow. Trade continues to be conducted. And that just seems to be the case. It's a sad reality. And I don't know why now again, of course, the country that could actually most easily make a difference, as we said many times, is the U.S., much more than China, because Israel is utterly dependent on the U.S. Israel would not survive without the U.S. It could not do what it does without this unconditional U.S. support. And if the U.S. one day cuts them off, then this will end. And you can't really say that for any other country, even China. Even if China says, we're not trading with you anymore. Yeah, that would hurt Israel, but they would survive as long as they had U.S. support. And probably the U.S. would just increase subsidies to Israel to make up for the losses. So it is the U.S. And then secondarily, after that, it would be Europe. If the Europeans united in actually condemning Israel and then you know, putting real action behind the words, and sanctioning Israel, imposing economic sanctions, for example, and it would affect them. It would make them think twice. I think they want to avoid that, but they would still survive because they would have the U.S. Now there have been some murmurings, or more than murmurings. Even Kaya Kallas came out with a fairly strong statement against Israel and a threat that, okay, hey, this has got to stop. If it doesn't, she was, I think, talking particularly about the killings of aid seekers, which happens every day. Just a couple dozen people are killed, starving people trying to get some sort of food are killed every day. This has been going on. We're talking about now hundreds and hundreds of people have been killed at these aid stations. And she said that specifically that this has to stop, and if it doesn't, there will be real consequences. I don't know, maybe there will be. That would be good. It would be a step in the right direction. But we heard language from European leaders that have been, which has been encouraging. They fairly strong words, but nothing ever seems to change. So I'm just not going to hold my breath there.
Yeah, I'm not even talking about necessarily China or other countries punishing Israel at this point. I'm just forcing aid into Gaza. Like, can why? I just don't understand how we can all sit by as a world and watch this population be genocided, be starved to death, be subject to this horror, these bombings and these snipings. It's just, the images are just so horrific. I see a baby with the leg blown off. And, this doesn't even get into the counted as a casualty, because this technically is still alive. Just think about how many children or have permanent brain damage because of the malnutrition now. It's just beyond horrible, what's happening. And you just think, we just rely on just one flotilla of some going in occasionally. We know it's not going to make it in there. And these things are just carrying baby formula and life-saving food and medicine for these people that are dying. Why can't we just get some country, like any country that has a navy that can give force its way in, not attacking Israel, but just saying, no, we cannot let these people starve to death. And if they did that, like if a country that is worried about, we talked about this before, there's a moral power vacuum now because of the United States has just completely shown its cards, that it's all in with Israel, and it's okay with genocide and regime change and starving people. So there is no moral leading force there. It's an opportunity for a country like China or a country like Russia to step up and say, this is wrong. We cannot let these people die. This whole civilian population starve to death. And they force themselves in there. They would be the heroes of the world. They would do great things for this country's soft power, if China did that. So I just think in their own self-interest, China can do that. When you talk about the surrounding neighbors, the Arab countries, it's more of their responsibility to hold Israel's feet to the fire in terms of like punishing it for its crimes, to protect the people that are dying. But I mean, at this point, just like, so much damage has been done. Are we really going to sit by and just watch Israel kill all of these people? Like, no, if somebody stops this, you will be a hero. Do it.
Right. Yeah. The problem is in the case of both Russia and China, is that, well, okay, yeah, we're not attacking Israel. That's what you're saying. But Israel is going to take it as an attack. Because they essentially, obviously, it's not supposed to be their territory, but they regard it as their territory. And the danger is that if either Russia or China actually forces entry into Gaza, then you're at war with Israel, and then therefore, by extension, with the United States. And there is a chance that this could actually turn into a world war. It seems ridiculous, but it's true. It seems to me it would be easier for the Europeans to pull it off if they could have, actually wake up, from this, how would you describe the European state of mind? This state of delusion and total moral bankruptcy. If they could wake up from that and do something, it would be hard for the Europeans, or for and then by extension the Americans, to start attacking the French, because they're not considered adversaries. It would be just a gray area, but it would be, I think, the chance of that turning into World War III is lower. But the Europeans just aren't going to do that. And I think the Russians and Chinese, I understand. I feel the same way. But I they actually would have a good argument. I can just imagine if that's something that ever came up, they'd say, we really can't risk that because this is, this would be considered an act of war, and it's just something we cannot do. It could plunge not just the region, but, the world into crisis, or more than crisis. It could actually set off World War III.
So you're saying, like, if China or Russia, like, airdropped life-saving aid into Gaza, or did open up some life-saving humanitarian corridor, through international waters, and then the Gaza, isn't that jurisdiction? That water is part of Palestine. It's Gaza waters. Like, Israel's not supposed to be there, right? Legally, technically.
Right, I know, exactly. Right, exactly. But obviously Israel is de facto under Israel's control. And yeah, they should. I mean, they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. They've been exercising control over the Gaza waters for a long time. You probably heard recently that they don't allow, fishermen on the waters. That's been true for years, actually. Even going back before October 7th. But now they don't even allow swimmers. You're not even allowed to bathe in the water. You don't have any fresh water. You're covered with dust. You're miserable. Maybe the one thing you could do to just relieve your agony is take a bathe in the Mediterranean, but they're not allowed to do that. So anyway, I'm just saying that they exercise control of it. It's de facto control. Yeah, by international law, that should be Gazan waters, but it's not. And they're going to take it as an attack on Israel. That's the way that they're going to receive it. And the U.S. is going to back them up. And then you could have a war between whatever power is trying to, force entry into Gaza and the U.S.
It's just so...
again, it just goes, I know, it's terrible. It really comes down to the U.S. is the country that could really make a difference and can make an immediate difference. Who could stop this? But obviously that's not happening.
But just let me get this right. So you're saying that if a country just tries to drop aid to save these people that are starving to death, a population that 50% of the population are children that are starving to death, that the U.S. and Israel might view that as an act of war of just trying to drop food in, whereas in any given week, the U.S. and Israel might have bombed half a dozen countries.
Yeah.
This is crazy. That the hypocrisy is just like, but that's not acceptable. Like, somebody has to that's not an excuse. That you're just saying that we have to roll over no matter, we can't save starving children because, these crazy people might take the idea that delivering baby formula to dying children is an act of war. Like, that's just
well, I mean, that's what
so beyond the pale.
There have been a lot of reports in the last few weeks of how, people trying to enter the Gaza Strip, carrying baby formula with them, are told to leave the baby formula behind. That's actually what's happened. There have been many, many reports of that. So yeah, you say, it's dropping baby formula into Gaza would be considered by the Israelis as an act of war. I mean, they have no compunction about going after aid workers within Gaza. We hear about those reports almost on a daily basis. I think just recently they shot or captured, I believe, and arrested a number of UN personnel. And last I heard, their whereabouts were unknown. They regard them as the enemy, as part of the, as much the enemy as an enemy army. So we're just talking about aid workers. Yeah, any foreign force that tried to force aid without prior permission from the Israelis. Well, again, it's absurd. You're right. It's unjust. It's those words aren't nearly strong enough, but that's the way it is. That's the kind of war that Israel's conducting.
It's so disgusting. It's just, being associated with this is just so gross. And I mean, that's why I find it hard to, talk about other things now. And I just see how present it is, because this is my country and we're complicit in this. And then we're talking about all these countries around the world. They're afraid. Right, they're afraid to intervene and save these people while everybody's just watching it on their phones dying. It's just like this. What will we look at this point in time when we go write the history books? The age of cowardice, where people are too afraid to stand up and speak out against this. I mean, I think every leader, every person is going to need to ask themselves these questions: like, what did you do during the Gaza genocide? Were you a supporter of Israel? Were you silent, or did you stand up and did you try to do something to end this, to stop this? Like, you don't need to see, how many years of dead babies do we need to see before somebody has, the balls to come up and say that this has to end now? Where are our leaders? Where is the world? It's so. It's just, I can't believe that this is just happening. It's just, we say never again, never again, and it's happening right in front of us, and nobody's doing anything.
Right.
And people are
you're right.
bending over backwards to try to make it okay.
Right. No, you're right. Now, of course, there are people who have been very brave and have denounced Israel and denounced the genocide and have suffered the consequences. Most recently there's Francesca Albanese from the UN, and now she's being sanctioned, by the U.S. It's just like, again, the one country that really can do something about it really is the U.S. And unfortunately, we're just, we don't even need to say, we're just all in on this. It's not just that we're tolerating it, we're actively supporting it.
Right. Yeah.
The US
I was
and
just
Israel
thinking
together is really committing this.
Right. Yeah. And, it just, I just see us getting further and further involved in it, more and more complicit, actively involved in the genocide, just because you see the people that Trump is surrounding himself with now. Like in the beginning of his presidency, it's like, okay, who's got Trump's ear? Okay, there's this character, Steve Witkoff, Marco Rubio saying some weird things, and all these people were kind of being thrown around and like, okay, have some influence. But now it seems like Trump has found his clan, and it's the worst clan ever. It's people like Lindsey Graham, with Mark Levine or Levin. These are like the worst possible people to have as your close inner circle, and these are the people that he seems to be really doubling down and listening to. So I just, we are going to be so stained. I hope
actually, but I mean, he's always been very, very closely allied with the Zionists, and really with the most extreme form of Zionism. And it has to be pointed out that Steve Witkoff, even though he did negotiate that ceasefire that I think was always intended to be broken, he himself is a Zionist. And if you remember that Tucker Carlson interview, it was clear. I listened to him talk about Israel and the Palestinians, and he spoke as a Zionist who clearly had his sympathies with, not just with the Israelis, but even with Netanyahu. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I guess there never was any hope.
We hoped. There was that ceasefire, but it was, again, we know what happened. And I think that was always the intention. It was always understood. That was the way that Netanyahu was talking about it when the ceasefire was still in effect. Don't worry, guys. He's telling his ultra-nationalist, ultra-Zionist allies, don't worry. This will be broken. And sure enough, it was broken.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to pivot over to Ukraine.
Okay.
I think one thing that, just talking about just sort of the visceral feeling I have towards Gaza is just because of the number of civilian casualties that are being inflicted in this war. But when you compare it to Ukraine, it's night and day difference how these wars are conducted. Now, the Ukrainian war, in a way, is just as tragic. More people have died in the Ukraine-Russia war. The thing that's different is that these are soldiers. So, right. Yeah, these are primarily two real armies fighting each other. It's not just one country eradicating a civilian population.
Right.
But I think it just kind of goes to show to the world, though, how the West is conducting war by our association with Israel and supplying Israel. This shows this is how America and the West is okay with war. And then the rest of the world is looking at Russia and how it's been conducting its war over the past 3 years. And I know if you're following just mainstream media, you might have this image that Russia is just targeting nursing homes and kindergartens 24/7. But the reality couldn't be more than the opposite than that, right? Further from the truth. I think Colonel Douglas Macgregor was saying.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I heard Colonel Macgregor saying that how remarkable how few civilians that have been killed by Russia in Ukraine, and that this is the cleanest war that he's ever seen since in modern history being conducted. You know, the levels to go to reduce the casualties. I don't know if you have what do you want to say about that? But.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to add that, you know, we've seen over the last few weeks, there have been almost nightly missile and drone attacks on a very large scale, a much larger scale than we've seen in the past. You know, we're talking about hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles, night after night after night. And, you know, they strike targets throughout the territory of Ukraine. But you know, occasionally there are civilian casualties, but often there are none. You know, we're talking about, you know, hundreds of targets hit, and there may not even be a single casualty. And sometimes there's maybe one fatality. Sometimes there's, you know, it's actually becomes newsworthy if we're talking about, let's say, you know, 6 people killed or something. That becomes a news story. And of course, that's tragic. I don't want to downplay that. But, you know, we're talking about very large scale attacks, you know, that are wreaking a great amount of destruction. And yet the casualties are minimal, sometimes non-existent. And that tells you something about how this war is being conducted. And then, you know, of course, the great majority of casualties, it seems funny. It's like both Trump and his wife get upset about the missile attacks, which have resulted in so few deaths. It's because I think they see it on TV, you know, it makes it, for some reason, Trump got really worked up about it. And you can see explosions in the city or whatever. You don't see much footage coming from the front line, but that's where, you know, most of the deaths occurred. And the vast majority of which, of course, are soldiers, which doesn't mean that, oh, this doesn't matter. Of course, you know, especially so many of these soldiers don't want to be there. You know, they'd rather not be, but they were conscripted and didn't have any choice. So it's a tragedy. It really is. It's an enormous tragedy, which we shouldn't downplay. But but the difference couldn't be greater. I mean, when we're talking about, I think according to the UN statistics, a total of 13,000 civilians have been killed, maybe 13,500 civilians have been killed in the Ukraine war on both sides total so far. And that's just a small fraction of what the known civilian deaths. Even, you know, we're not talking, well, actually it's 13,500 deaths of fatalities in both cases, but it's just a fraction of what we're seeing in a much smaller scale, you know, in a much smaller territory in Gaza in a shorter period of time.
Right. How big of an impact do you think this is having between sort of the battle between U.S. hegemony and multipolarity, just the way that these wars are being conducted? Because we see, you know, Iran and Russia, when it carries out strikes, they're very careful. I don't think, you know, there's not this intention to inflict civilian casualties. Whereas what we see, how Israel's conducting its wars, you know, backed by the United States, it's just, you know, maximize civilian casualties. Let's strike during the day and, you know, refugee tents, apartment buildings, whatever. No regard.
Yeah, hospitals, mosques, churches. Right. And that's not just an occasional stray missile. That's just the kind of thing that happens every day there. And it's been happening for, you know, 600 plus days. Yeah, that's just the way it is. I'm sure it is affecting people. You know, I think that over time, you know, when the Ukraine war first erupted, I think there was a great deal of sympathy for Ukraine around the world, you know, people. But as time went by and they started to understand, you know, Russia's position, its reasons for going into this war, and the way that it went into the war with a hope for a negotiated settlement, and then you see how they're conducting the war. I think over time, I know over time. I mean, that's what the polls show. There has been a steady shift in sympathy towards Russia, most of the world help but notice the hypocrisy and the way these two wars are being conducted and how differently they're being conducted. It's something that's hidden, by rhetoric on the West, within the West, within that information sphere. But in the rest of the world, the hypocrisy is there for everybody to see.
Right. Okay, well, let's talk about what's happening on the battlefield, because it sounds like there's some large developments. Pokrovsk, it looks like it's about to fall. Can you tell us why Pokrovsk is so important? And do you see this as a major pivotal moment in the world, perhaps the pivotal moment in the war?
Well, it's hard to say. This war could go on for a long time. We don't know how far the Russians are going to go. So I wouldn't say that it may be the pivotal moment, at least in the battle for the Donbass or Donetsk. It's probably fair to say that. Okay. But who knows? This war may go on for a couple more years, and there may be bigger battles lying ahead. It is important. First of all, it is a major logistical hub. There are several major roads and rail lines that meet in Pokrovsk. Now, this logistical hub was very, very important for the Ukrainians, when they had it under control, and the line of contact was further east. Now that the Russians have already, they haven't encircled it yet, but they have it in a semicircle, and they have fire control over most of the rest of it. So it's nearly cut off, and so it can no longer serve as the logistical hub for the Ukrainians. But it's still important because it's part of once they take Pokrovsk, then Konstantinovka is going to be exposed on its, I guess you could say, its southern flank. And then with Konstantinovka is part of this, this conurbation of three cities, with Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And those are the last cities of Donetsk. So it's you could look at it as kind of a domino that's going to bring down the last, the first of four dominoes that will result in the final conquest of Donetsk. And then once the Russians do have control of it, then they can make it into their own logistical hub, and it will support operations farther to the west. I mean, we saw that with like the fall of Avdiivka, and once they got that, and then also Ugledar, then everything moves very much more rapidly. And I think we're going to see something similar after they take Pokrovsk. Yeah, I don't know how long it's going to last. The other reports are that they have actually penetrated into Pokrovsk. It's not clear if they, if this is just a raid, a reconnaissance and sabotage raid, or if it's something more permanent. And, where the information that's coming out is pretty limited now, but the Russians are in Pokrovsk already, and they're fairly deeply in Pokrovsk, and at the same time, they are continuing to extend the pinchers around Pokrovsk. So it does look, very grim. I think, sometimes you can be surprised how long a dedicated or a few dedicated units can hold out, especially in a city where they've had some time to dig themselves in. But with the supply lines cut, it's just a matter of time. And, the Russians coming at them from many different directions, I don't think they can hold out for very long.
So when it falls, what do we see happening next? Do you see the West panicking and getting more involved?
Well, who knows? It's... we see that when Avdiivka fell, which was in February of last year, there was sort of an uptick in panic. And I think that may have set off a lot of the talk by Macron, for example, about sending troops. And we may see some of the same things. I just don't know if they really can do much. The fact is that they're doing everything they can, and so what else can they do other than actually sending troops? And I think, they understand that they really can't. That's not really an option. It's obviously been something that's been floated, both by Starmer and Pokrovsk and some other European leaders, but it never seems to go anywhere. I think their own defense.
Is it Starmer and Pokrovsk?
Did I say that? Oh, I'm Macron.
Yeah.
Macron and Starmer.
Macron, okay.
Forgive
Macron,
me.
okay.
Yeah, thank you for correcting me. Yeah. So anyway, This is just, this is something that has been floated in the past. The fact is, it's not feasible. They, sending troops to Ukraine. So what can they do? I mean, they say, well, we can. It's always the same talk. More sanctions, more weapons. Well, they don't really have. They're already sending them as many weapons as they can. They've already imposed something last count is approximately 30,000 sanctions on Europe. They've done the 18th sanctions package. Is there any reason to believe that sanctions package number 19 is going to make a difference, or 10 more Patriot interceptors or whatever? It's just like the flow to weapons has already decreased over time, and that is simply because they have gone through their stockpiles and they're now actually drawing from their monthly production runs, and that's just not enough. It just isn't. And you do get some of that honesty. We got that from the Pentagon, and occasionally we see that in some of the mainstream media. So what can they do about it? I mean, they can panic, and they probably will to some extent, but the Russians are going to continue to march forward.
I mean, I guess it's the long-range missile strikes, right? That's what everyone's, worried about.
Yeah,
Will they do JASSMs?
That is a real... Right, exactly. Again, it's the extended range JASSMs that could actually hit Moscow and St. Petersburg, and certainly a Tomahawk could. Now, those haven't been approved. They've been brought up. The Tomahawk was shot down. But, we've seen this happen before. Apparently, the Taurus is discussed from time to time, but then eventually we hear from the Germans, no, we're not going to do this. But there may always, at some point, the panic might be such that, one of these weapon systems is introduced. And then we do have an escalation, an obvious escalation that the Russians really would have to respond to. If, for example, an extended range JASSM struck the center of Moscow or something, that would be a huge escalation, and the Russians would just have to respond. I think there's no way that they can spin it. They would have to respond in some very significant way. I can't say that couldn't happen. I mean, those weapon systems exist. The ground forces really don't exist. I mean, they're so puny that I think everybody would understand that it's only symbolic. And they really can't do any damage to the Russians. The Russians would be able to take care of them rapidly. I mean, we're talking about, France or England. They may be able to send something, 10,000 men or whatever. But that's just, that's at the current rate, we're just talking about like a month's worth of casualties or something. It's really insignificant. And they would probably be worth a lot less than your Ukrainian troops because they haven't fought this war. They've been trained for a different kind of war. And you put them there, they just would be sitting ducks. But a missile could get through. There are these missiles that can reach cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Even though Russia has very, very good air defense, there's always a chance. There's nothing is 100%. A missile could get through, especially a new one that they haven't been able to build up a profile on. When these systems were first introduced, usually it was like in the first week or so that you saw the most success. And then over time, the Russians learned how to neutralize these threats. And so now you just hardly ever hear anything about it and ATACMS, and, partly because there's so few of them, or Storm Shadow. But we haven't heard about them for a long time because the threat has been largely neutralized by the Russians. But when you first introduce a system, that's the moment of vulnerability. A missile could get through. It could do some very significant damage in a major city, and that would be a huge escalation. I think that's probably something for us to be worried about. Again, it's something that could happen. Right now, they have enough sense. They're enough level-headed people who are saying, no, we're not going to do this. But I don't know if it's Pokrovsk or it'll be a future city like Slavyansk or Kramatorsk, or maybe the crossing of the Dnieper or something, or else, where it just, the hysteria becomes such that, they no longer listen to the level-headed people, and they give these weapon systems to Ukraine. And then, of course, we always have to remind ourselves they're not just giving it to Ukraine. They're actually going there because their own technicians have to operate them. Yeah, that
Wow.
is a real concern.
talking about shooting a missile into Moscow. Like,
I'm not
I
saying
mean,
it's
that's
going to
something
happen,
on.
but
I
it's
know,
something they
I
could,
know,
yeah, but it's
but that
something
this
they
is
could
something
do.
that was right, and this is something that was just unthinkable, like during any previous time. I just thought it was unthinkable
Oh
in
yeah,
Cold War, but
right.
now we're thinking about it.
Yeah,
Just the fact that we're thinking about it is crazy.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
maybe we lob a missile to Moscow and that'll solve our problems. Like, whoa, okay,
Yeah,
well,
right.
boring.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's still we have enough. There are enough people again who say, yeah, no, this is crazy. We're not doing that. But yeah, you're right. The fact that we're thinking about it, and there are obviously people that are pushing for it. But something is, things have changed over these two wars. Both in Gaza and in Ukraine have changed things. So it's just like we're doing things now that we could not have conceived of, even 3 years ago. We are sending them weapon systems already. We've sent them weapon systems that we swore we wouldn't because there was too great a risk of escalation. Now
Yeah,
we've gone all the way up, to the ATACMS sent into pre 2014 Russia, and like the next thing would be JASSMs and then Tomahawks. We've already come right up to that point. And before that was just, that's impossible. Now we have to say it's possible. Maybe it won't happen. Let's hope that cooler heads prevail, but it's possible. And then, of course, we've just seen this general kind of this increasing callousness, that has developed over the course of the war on Gaza. Again, I think we made this point before. Like the first hospital that was hit, there was a controversy over it, and there was some wringing of hands, and the Israelis went all out to try to spin it and to put the blame on Hamas or Islamic Jihad. And then, it's just like they got away with it, and then it just was one hospital after another. So now we're talking about 90% of the hospitals, or very nearly 100%, have been either destroyed or very seriously damaged. And it's clearly unintentional in almost all the cases. But it's just nothing said. Doesn't even make the news. Things have changed. I mean, it's just like the things that used to shock us don't shock us anymore. And these
right.
are very disturbing trends. Again, it's just that we've become used to, in one case, the risk of, I could contrast this with the Cold War years. I remember there was a real fear of nuclear war. And it wasn't like I say, okay, we don't like the Soviet Union. We don't like their ideology. We don't like the way they structure their society. But we cannot risk nuclear war. We got to talk to them. We have to get along with them. That was understood by the vast majority of people that ran our government. Not just in the U.S., but in the West. And the people who criticized that and want us to, risk nuclear war, they were just considered nuts. Those were the crazies. Now the crazies are running the show. Things have really changed. And then again, in the case of Israel, there would be an incident that might occur like 20 years ago in southern Lebanon that actually drew a lot of attention, all kinds of condemnation. The Israelis had to apologize, whatever. I mean, there were limits, there were standards, and they were to some extent enforced. Just obviously not strictly enough. Though Israel was criticized, Israel had to pull back in certain cases. Well, the aid always flowed. The relationship remained solid, and that's why Israel was able to continue going down this road. But now, those incidents occur every day or several times a day, and nothing is said. Things have changed, and they've changed for the worse.
Yeah, it's just so damning for the West, how we've been so complicit in this. It really is. And then, like you said, with Europe, I mean, and just the Western world in general, they're just led by crazies. I mean, the idea, like we said, during the Cold War of trying to shoot a missile into the Soviet Union, we don't do that. We don't ever even think about that. And now we have leaders that clearly want to shoot missiles into Moscow. You see them itching. Like Merz especially seems like a bit of a real nutcase. I mean, and same thing with Starmer and Macron. They're all in, like they're all prepping. They're talking about, let's get ready to go to war. We got to, and they want to hit Moscow. It's like, it seems pretty clear. They want to put these missiles into Ukraine and start firing them deep into Russia. And they just want the U.S. to sign off it. And they're just thinking of any sneaky little way to get around it. There was this rumor, I don't know if you can talk about it some, about the Taurus missile. being sent to Ukraine, and essentially the Ukrainians slap a "Made in Ukraine" sticker on it, and say like, "Oh, look, this was made here domestically," but it's a German Taurus missile, essentially repackaged. And then Ukraine will use this Taurus missile, shoot into it. And I think if Russia sees it, like, well, okay, yeah, we can see it's. We open it up, and it's like, yeah, that's a Taurus missile. It's all German components. It's all German everything. So, like, I don't think that's going to fool the Russians. But you see them working that hard to try to find some type of loophole to shoot a missile into Moscow. So it just feels like that's where we're going.
Yeah, well, clearly there are people like Mertz, I think, who want to do it. Yeah, yeah, I've heard about that scheme. I don't know. Well, we don't really know what that. That came up, I think, like 2 or 3 months ago, and then it seems like it's died. So I don't know if there's any attempt to do that or not. But you're right. That's the kind of thing that there's these people are driven. They really don't want to let go of it. And that's the danger. It's like, okay, yeah, there are the cooler heads that have been prevailing so far, but there are people like Mertz who really wants to send those Tauruses to Ukraine. He really does. It's obvious. And he will continue to scheme and scheme and scheme. Maybe this slap a Ukraine, made in Ukraine sticker on the missile, that won't work out, but there's something else. And then the instant that there is some sort of, another city falls, whether it's Pokrovsk or it's another city, or maybe there is a missile that goes astray and kills many civilians. Things will happen in this war where the temperature will rise all of a sudden, and these people who are driven, who are obsessed with the idea of sending long-range missiles to Ukraine will immediately. They haven't given up. They, for the time being, right now they've been unable to carry out their schemes. But the moment that something happens, an incident that again raises the temperature, they're going to leap forward, and they're going to offer and start pushing, the Taurus or the JASSMs or the Tomahawk. It'll happen again and again. And the danger is that one of these times they'll succeed. They'll get through, they'll achieve their objective of sending that long-range missile to Ukraine. And then we're in a really dangerous situation.
I mean, you're in Moscow right now. I know you haven't got to really get the feel of what the things are like there right now. You just arrived, but do you think that people in Russia and Moscow are worried about this at all? That, a larger war with NATO, or they kind of resign to the fact that we are going to be going to war with NATO, or already are at war with NATO, or that missiles might land in Moscow? You're there. Are you worried?
Yeah. Well, no, I'm not worried. I was just slightly concerned, about the chance of the airport being shut down, as I mentioned at the top of this podcast here. And we are concerned about it at the end. We're going to be outside. We're going to actually be in Sochi, towards the end of this vacation. And we chose to actually get an early flight back because we know there is a chance the airport will be shut down, a flight will be delayed. So we're not going to wait for the last day and just, assume that everything will go right. So we're giving us, ourselves 3 extra days. So it is something that you have to think about. Neither of the two major Moscow airports have been actually hit so far. They're being very cautious, as they should be. It's just like when drones are in the air headed towards Moscow, then they shut down the airports until all of the drones have been brought down. They're erring on the side of caution, as they should. My main source of information is your sister. And she says it's just not, she has a fairly wide circle of friends, both expats and Russians. And nobody seems to be concerned about it. It's just not something that people worry about. They go about it in their daily lives. And you can understand that, first of all, Moscow is a very large city. And though these hundreds and hundreds, and actually, probably over the course of the war, thousands of drones have been sent towards Moscow, but the Moscow air defense in particular is very good. And, maybe 200 are sent and 199 are brought down outside of Moscow. And maybe the 200th, makes it into Moscow, but is shot down, and then debris falls on one street. And in one case, it was actually a street not too far from where your sister lived, but nobody was hurt. It's just like all the things that happen in a big city in a day, it's pretty minor. It just doesn't affect life. I mean, I think the only people that are have been affected by it are air travelers, especially in the last couple of weeks. Um, yeah, again, this is not a scientific survey, but I think by and large, again, I've only been a day here, but it just looks everything. I don't notice anything different. I don't, you don't see soldiers. There's no signs of militarization. People are going about their daily lives. Everything seems very peaceful. People, of course, do talk about it, but and they do. What I've heard, this is coming from secondary sources, is that the Russians are very realistic about it. They understand that in a way they're fighting NATO already. They understand it could expand, and if it does, they feel like they're ready for it. One of the things, I think it's clear that it may be part of the reason too that the Russians are moving so slowly and methodically, and they're not committing lots of forces. I mean, one of the thoughts is, I don't know what they're actually saying in the Kremlin, but one interpretation, of their conduct of the war so far is that they're always keeping in mind, they have contingency plans for a direct NATO intervention, and they want to make sure that they have the forces ready for that. So they don't want to, commit all the forces immediately. They're building up forces for the possibility of a larger conflict. This is not something, of course, that they want to happen, but they say, yeah, it might happen, but we'll be ready for it when it does happen, or if it does happen, I should say.
Hmm. Okay, I want to move over to Zelensky a bit. There's rumors of him potentially going to be thrown under the bus. There are protests in Kiev. I saw some, and they're quite large. You can just see on X. A lot of it is this stripping these anti-corruption bodies of their power, basically to let's go full corruption. We already knew Ukraine was corrupt, and now they're just getting rid of the anti-corruption part. So we're not even going to pretend. And I think that's causing a lot of displeasure amongst the Ukrainian people, even the Ukrainians that identify with the far right, with as Banderites. Even I think it's a largely unpopular move. Actually, I don't know about the Banderite stuff, but can you tell about just his position right now? How much trouble is Zelensky in?
Yeah, right. Well, we had some reasons to think that his position might be precarious, a week ago or so. There were some, stories appeared in some of the leading media outlets in the West, directly criticizing Zelensky and the way he's, running his government, the increasing authoritarian bit. I don't know that it really has increased so much. It just seems like they decided finally to notice what's going on. It's funny, and others have pointed this out too, but it's just like, it seems like everything that's called a Russian talking point at some point will actually start to be expressed by the mainstream in the West. You were not allowed to, if you said it a year ago or 2 years ago, you're clearly a very bad person, clearly being paid by the Kremlin or something. But now they're saying it because I think in the way, reality has a way of winning in the end. And it, for whatever reason, now they're acknowledging the reality. Now, it may be that they're acknowledging the reality because the U.S. or the West, the collective West, has decided that it's time for Zelensky to go, and so they're telling their faithful scribes in these major newspapers that yes, it's time to depict Zelensky in a negative light, because we want to get rid of him, and maybe that's just what's going on. And then there was that Seymour Hersh piece that said just that. It's just like that basically Zelensky had to go. And now we see this, but it was not long after that Seymour Hersh piece came out that Zelensky made this move against the anti-corruption bureaus and, basically shut them down, deprive them of their independence. An anti-corruption bureau only really has teeth if it's independent and it's not under the control of the
Right.
the government that it's supposed to be investigating. Now, so you look at that and you say, well, okay, well, first of all, maybe Well, okay, I think it's important to add an additional piece of information. It turns out these anti-corruption bureaus are basically run by the U.S. And that's something that Putin himself pointed out. Actually, it was in his February 22nd speech right there at the launch of the SMO. He said that he named the two of them. One of them is what I think it's basically called the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and the other, I forgot the name of the other agency. But he says both of these are run by the U.S. And if you look at the history, you go back to the stories on the establishment of these. They are basically U.S. entities. So is Zelensky actually going after? Is he just trying to protect his own racket? Protect him and his friends simply from make sure they can continue to misappropriate funds, and so on and so forth. He wants to he's making a lot of money off of this corruption and wants to continue to do so, not just himself, but, all of his various associates. Or is it actually that he understands, these things too, kind of, they come together. He understands that this is a tool of the Americans. He understands the Americans are out to get him. So he's going to deprive them of this particular weapon, these agencies that they control. And that, he sees, I think, in fact, some sort of investigation against Zelensky was launched recently by one of them. And he saw that as maybe just, this wasn't just wasn't motivated by a completely disinterested concern for justice. It wasn't just about rooting out corruption, but I think probably everything this agency does is political. It was the beginnings of an attack on Zelensky, and that's how Zelensky took it. And so he decided to take him out to protect himself. Again, it's like Zelensky is a terrible commander, but he knows how to stay in power. He understands how Ukrainian politics works. And very interestingly, soon after he made his move was supported by the Rada because he basically controls it. That's the Ukrainian parliament. So he's basically declaring to the Americans, don't even think about it. Maybe some of you, maybe all of you want to get rid of me, but I'm not going. I'm not going without a fight.
So do you think that we will try to get rid of him? That's where it is. I mean, he's becoming. This is obviously got to be pretty unpopular within Ukraine, right? This move to strip these anti-corruption agencies, even if it is a U.S. I mean, is that what's kind of almost happening? That there's a split coming in within Ukraine now. The ones that maybe are supporting Zelensky, and the other ones that are more kind of on, I don't know, the U.S. side of these anti-corruption agencies,
right.
and that there's a civil war that could potentially brew.
Right. Yeah, no, you wonder how much of it is about corruption and how much of it is about supporting the West. Because actually the original Maidan uprising, again, that was supported by the West, and it was about joining the West. That's what motivated. You look at actually polls taken at that time. Well, both of the supporters and then of the general population. The general population really wasn't supportive of Maidan, but you found among Maidan supporters, something like 98% of them generally came from Western Ukraine and were committed to joining the West. That's what it was all about. Now we've got the signal. I mean, these crowds came out, but they came out after, maybe just a coincidence, but they came out after the European leaders openly criticized the Zelensky government, and in particular said that this move would endanger the possibility of future membership in the EU. Now, remember, that's really what Maidan was about. It was about joining the EU. And now, I think maybe that's what these crowds are responding to. That's what brought them out, initially, or, back in 2014. And maybe this is what's bringing them out again. It's a real problem for Zelensky. He's, again, part of his main selling point was that he had been a good spokesman for Ukraine, and he's always, there are all these photos of him with Western leaders and, shaking hands and writing checks for him. And now that you get, for the first time, maybe a real threat. We'll see how real, well, it is, but from Western leaders, that's going to weaken his position. But maybe he can survive it because he has been preparing for this. He has been consolidating his power. He's been getting rid of rivals for a long time, and may say, okay, well, the people are against you, and even the Western governments are against you. But he just is thinking, well, so what? He doesn't want that to happen, but he's prepared for it, and he may be able to outlast, any all kinds of pressure. Now, I mean, if the Americans and the Europeans decided that he just has to go, and they could make it happen, I don't think there's any question about it. But we'll see how they may decide that it could get ugly. Maybe they don't want to have an open fight. They don't want to risk a civil war or whatever, or open factional, potentially violent, factional fighting within the government. So they may decide that, okay, it's just going to cost us too much to get rid of him. We'll pull back. I think that's what he's hoping for.
Yeah, I imagine trying to depose Zelensky would be an absolute mess for the West. I mean, they've spent so much time and energy building up Zelensky as this Churchillian figure. Yeah. And if they have to go after him by revealing that, hey, he's the opposite of this Churchillian figure, he's, forced conscription, killing political rivals or jailing them, and just, all this corruption, all this stuff that we've known about. How's that going to work for the Ukraine narrative? It's done, right? It seems like a dangerous move. So why do they want to depose him? Is there what did Zelensky do that would make them want to depose of him now that's been so egregious?
Well, I don't know. It's like, who knows what happens behind the scenes? It just may be an act of desperation. It's just thinking, well, things aren't working out. Clearly, we've tried this. So I'm just saying from the point of view of Western leaders. We've done this, we've done that. Nothing seems to work. Maybe the problem is Zelensky. I don't know if it's the thinking is any deeper than that. Sometimes you do hear about friction between NATO and Zelensky on strategy. I remember that during the 2023 summer offensive. Like they didn't want him to be diverting so many forces to Bakhmut. That's just one example. Now, there was some criticism, too, of the Kursk incursion, though it seems like there was also involvement, especially, I think, from the British. So there have been frictions, and I think that he's always had his enemies, let's say, within within NATO and within the different administrations. And maybe, his enemies are pushing harder now that things have been going badly in Ukraine, and saying, well, maybe the problem is Zelensky. We just got to get rid of him. I don't know if it's anything particular that he's done. Again, he's always had his enemies, and it just may be that, it's just the increasingly bleak situation there has given the upper hand to his enemies, at present.
Yeah, that the West is desperate. If we talk about some of their options, like, okay, maybe depose of Zelensky, which could cause a civil war. I mean, this would be a mess trying to do this. Yeah. Depose, right. What it sounds like, or lob a missile into Moscow.
Yeah, but it could get ugly, because we have these ultranationalists, and it seems like he's been getting cozier and cozier with them, over time, and. They're the guys with the guns. They're the ones who really are willing to fight. You may have the masses, in the Maidan, but they're unarmed, and they can create a certain amount of pressure. It's bad press, but that's not sufficient to, it's not enough to bring him down.
Oof. We just thinking about the situation of these leaders, situation of Zelensky, the situation of Netanyahu, and the situation of Donald Trump. That is such a recipe for disaster. All three of these guys are so screwed, but they're involved in very dangerous conflicts with very powerful enemies, and they are both completely tied to the United States and the U.S. is in big trouble as well. Just with Trump's
Yeah.
personal situation with Epstein and everything else, it's just
Right.
this thing is going to blow, man.
Yeah, no, it's
I
a
don't know.
dangerous mix, right? It's a combination of some very serious conflicts, and then the political leaders that are under extreme pressure and are finding their backs are against the wall, and they could do anything. Again, it's just like I know we've pointed this out before. If there's no conflict going on, you can't. It's hard to start a whole new war. But if there's a war that's already, in if the war has already started, it's much easier to escalate than to start a whole new war. So it's just like, it's like the vehicle's already moving and you need to just add a little extra gas. But that little extra bit of gas, that escalation could put us in very, very dangerous territory very quickly. And yeah, I wouldn't put it beyond any of these three actors from making, we've already seen it happen. It's clear that it's already happened, I think, in the case of all three, but especially Zelensky and Netanyahu making very risky moves for their own personal benefit.
Ooh. Yeah, veritable three musketeers we have right here. These guys, it's scary. Okay, Dad. Well, I think we can end it there.
Okay.
I hope you're recovering from jet lag, and enjoy your first couple days
so
in
far,
Moscow.
so
We'll
good.
talk to you soon. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Have a good rest of your day. Bye bye.
All right. Bye-bye.